Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. You mentioned the West has imposed a standard of human rights for the rest of the world. Is this in reference to the UN Declaration of Human Rights? Yes, it is, primarily so. If so, what issues do you have with the UN Declaration of Human Rights? I think some of the, most of what the UN declared will be accepted, by the way. But there are certain things, for example, the freedom to dress the way you like. Now, in an Islamic country, that doesn't apply. The freedom to behave the way you like. Because the West has its way of treating its subjects. We have our ways too. In an Islamic country, if you choose to an Islamic country, you have to live according to certain standards. Whether it comes to dressing, whether it comes to behavior, we do have certain things and certain ways to behave. And therefore, you may have heard, for example, of this very famous Iranian actress who decided to go to France and bear or whatever in public. You heard of that? It happened only, I think, 2-3 days ago. And she has now been barred to go back to Iran. Because there are certain ways that we expect. She goes to Iran and wears a full hijab, and then goes to France and goes on the screen topless. So, sorry? Yeah, I know. So Iran has actually come up very clearly. It says, no, you cannot come back to Iran. Maybe you're an Iranian citizen. Because we expect certain standards. So that's what I mean by UN imposing its understanding or its standard on others. You cannot do that. To give you an example, it was decided by Maulana Rizvi of how the West imposes the standard. He says in the olden days, you know, the people in Africa, they wore very little, just covered the private parts. And the British came to my country, Tanzania, in Africa. They look at these Africans, they're so savages, they are so culturally backwards, they have no clothes on. So let's put some clothes on them. And after about 50 years, the British went back. Now the British were not wearing clothes, and the Africans were. And the British says, look at how barbaric and savages these Africans were. They're wearing clothes. So in other words, who is barbaric, savage, etc. is determined by the West. Okay, I'll do this quickly. Could you provide a practical example how we can act upon the principles of human rights that you mentioned? For example, what should our community look like? What activities, programs should we see in our communities to help us fulfill our responsibility in advancing the rights of all people? To some degree, I think that we've already talked about it. But one thing, and I see, mashallah, a lot of sisters here, I want to challenge you. Do you ever go to churches, to synagogues, to other places and talk to non-Muslims? Don't forget, you are no longer sisters in Islam, you are actually colleagues in Islam too. If we go, the men, we are supposed to speak out. How about you? I hardly ever do it. And again, don't get me wrong. I'm not insulting you, I'm challenging you. We hardly ever have many sisters come and talk about Imam Hussein in front of men. As if this is a monopoly of men. It's not. In other words, you can come and speak up and be articulate. Not only on Hussein Day programs, but go out to churches. Women can talk about women's issues far better than men can. Isn't that right? And yet, I have hardly ever seen Muslim women talk about it. In Colorado, as I said, where I lived there for 9 years, I noticed one thing was that Muslim women, especially Ahlul Sunnah, the women also were going out and speaking. And they were able to engage the non-Muslim far more. Because non-Muslims always thought, you know, the normal picture. A Muslim woman, poor thing, suppressed, oppressed, forced to wear a hijab. One lady said, do you think I was born in this hijab? I chose to wear it. I wear it because I love to wear it. That made a big impact on non-Muslims. So that's one challenge I think we can do. The community itself, honestly, sometimes I want to give up on the community. Because our communities can barely see beyond the parking lot and the food and whether there should be partition or not in the mosque. The vision is not tunnel vision, it's no vision. I asked them once, what vision do you have? I said, we have a television. That kind of tells you. That's the only vision that they have, television. Anyway, final one on my side. Is there such a belief that going to Hajj is part of someone's qismah? And if this is true, then of those that die without going to Hajj, was it part of their qismah that their sins are not removed in this life? First of all, part of it may be a qismah, but it's also a question of willingness, preparedness, and pushing yourself at times to go. Yes, but a person cannot go because he or she doesn't have physical resources, financial or mental, then of course they are not held to be responsible. But if you are able to go when you are young, trust me. My first Hajj was when I was 19. And I'm glad. I just went for the 6th time, I think, this year. It was tough. So if you can go go when you are young. It's not only more easy, it's also more financially practicable. When I went, it used to be like, $1,000 those days, 1976 I'm talking about. Now it's like $6,500, $7,000. So go when you are young and you are able to do so.
There's many questions. I'll try to answer the ones that I can. So the first question related to the lecture is, you'd mentioned that the Arabs during the time of Jahiliyyah found it hard to accept Islam because they did not want to perform aslama, that is, give up anything like their power and wealth in the name of God. But do you think this may have also attracted some people, that it was freeing to some people to believe and accept that there is something greater and more permanent than this world and its transience? Yes, certainly, and I think this is one of the reasons why so many of the poor were attracted to the message of Rasulullah and to the Imams in general and to the Sahaba. That's after they started, but many of the Sahaba were very poor, we know that, right? And the message that Rasulullah brought to them was so liberating, right? And what it told them, that your poverty means nothing to me. You're welcome in my home, in my faith, whether you be poor or whether you be rich, right? And that's what we recited in the ayah at the beginning, right? That whether they be poor or whether they be rich, God comes before them, right? In the law of Labihima, right? That God takes precedence before them. So certainly this notion of equality before God was an attractive feature for the poor. But just because someone's poor doesn't necessarily mean that they would do aslama, because that also requires someone to submit to God and put aside their animalistic instincts. So they may not have wealth, but they may have animalistic instincts of unrestrained anger, unrestrained lust, unrestrained jealousy, so on and so forth. The poor person and the rich person are required to put aside those emotions in the name or in the process of submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the meaning of their ibadah, of servitude, right? So it's two things, one material and one an internal struggle as well, right? So for that, in that way, the poor would also be challenged to give up their animalistic desires in the name of serving God. Is there a source or book which could provide more insight about mysticism in Islam? There's so many. There's just so many books. Anne-Marie Schimmel is a wonderful scholar. She has a book called Mystical Dimensions of Islam. But for practical mysticism or practical worship of God and communicating with God, I really think the 40 Hadith of Imam Khomeini, which is a decent translation, is an excellent book. But I would suggest it be worked on with a teacher if possible, or maybe in the form of a class, but it's a wonderful powerhouse of a book. I think it's just reading one chapter a month would be sufficient, certainly. Okay. Is it possible to have connection with imams, and if yes, is it through angels or not? That's a good question, whether it's possible to have connection with the imams. I think so, yes, because God says, do not think of those that are slain in the way of Allah as dead. Rather, they are being sustained by God, right? In the Holy Quran. So in the sense that the imam exists and is present, and when we send our salam to the imam sends his salam back to us, inshallah. So in that sense, yes, it is possible, but it's a very long theological discussion as to how and why it's possible, and I don't think it's the forum and the time to get into that. But yes, it is possible. And as Ayatollah Wahid says in one of his lectures, he's one of the great Marajas of the city of Qom. People ask, so why do we not communicate, or why do we not feel the presence of the current Imam al-Hujjah? And he says, actually I don't think it's him, but he just repeats it from another source, that our sins are like the clouds covering the sun. That it's our own impurity and our own lack of aslama, our own laziness to give up something in the process of submitting to God which blocks us from the Imam of our time. Dua ahad is a wonderful and very powerful way of communicating with the Imam, especially if you were to recite it for 40 Salat al-Fajrs consecutively. It can do quite miracles, and if anyone wants to know more about that, we can discuss it later. There's amazing stories we have in the biographies of some of the great ulama, the use of Dua al-Ahad, things of this nature. Could you please explain the word wali, and what does it mean when the Quran says, do not take non-believers as your awliya? Well, here awliya means masters, someone that you must obey instead of the Prophet. Right? And you have to also remember the context of the verse, which is the Prophet was trying to establish a strong polity in Medina, and at this time, the non-Muslims at that time were in a conflict with him, right? And he required that to be a part of the state of Medina that you show allegiance to him, right? And by showing allegiance to another leader, it would compromise your allegiance to your political allegiances specifically towards the Prophet, right? Because they were in a state of war at that time, right? Just like here, for example, if Canada is at war with another country, and you go and become a citizen of that other country during this state of war, and you tell that other country that I will fight for your army, or I will follow all your laws, and so forth, and I will take part in your insurrection, then you're taking them as an awliya, for example, right? So we have to look at the context of the word talking to you can shed more light upon that, but it doesn't mean friend. It means master, and someone who dominates you and makes decisions, spiritual and religious decisions for you, right? And we're not in that situation.